The cold hospital corridor echoed with the distant beep of machines as my body lay fragile on the gurney, trying to hold on. But it wasn't the pain from my failing heart that cut deepest. It was the moment the nurse whispered to me, "Hide, he's here." My own son had come not to comfort me, but to finish what he'd started. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the radiator clanged like chains and the winter wind whistled through gaps in the old windows. The building was one of those pre-war structures that New York is famous for. Thick walls that held secrets and thin floors that let you hear your neighbors' lives bleeding through. For years, my mornings felt like walking through fog. The harsh December light filtering through my threadbare curtains never quite warmed the rooms filled with worn furniture and faded photographs. I'd wake to silence, often finding an empty teacup on my nightstand from the night before, the scent of old pine needles from last Christmas still lingering in the corners where my small artificial tree once stood. This Christmas night was supposed to be different. I had been expecting David, my son, to visit. We'd talked about it briefly over the phone 2 weeks earlier. His voice had been distant, distracted, but he'd said the words I'd been longing to hear. "Maybe I'll stop by on Christmas, Mom." Maybe. That single word should have warned me, but hope has a way of making fools of us all. Instead of David's knock on my door, the evening brought something else entirely. The crushing pain in my chest started as I was washing the single plate I'd used for dinner. My hands went numb, and the ceramic clattered into the sink, chipping against the faucet. The pain spread like wildfire across my left arm, and I knew immediately what was happening. I called 911 with shaking fingers, my voice barely a whisper, as I gave my address. 1247 Amsterdam Avenue, apartment 4B. The words felt foreign in my mouth as if I were describing someone else's life. The paramedics arrived within minutes, young faces full of professional concern, their hands gentle as they lifted me onto the stretcher. But as we raced through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan, beneath those flashing blue lights, something unexpected happened. I felt hope flutter in my chest alongside the cardiac medicine they'd given me. Like every mother who had ever walked these ruthless city streets, I'd sacrificed everything for my family. Surely, I thought, surely this emergency would bring David running to my side. Expectation crashes hard against reality, doesn't it? The emergency room at Mount Sinai was a maze of bleeping monitors and hurried footsteps. Nurses in scrubs moved like dancers in a choreographed emergency, their sneakers squeaking against linoleum floors that had seen thousands of stories like mine. I was assigned to bed 7 in the cardiac unit, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the constant hum of machines keeping hearts beating. A photograph tucked in my purse caught my eye as the nurse helped me change into that humiliating hospital gown. It was the only one where David smiled genuinely, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in Central Park about 10 years ago. He'd been 42 then, still unmarried, still calling me every Sunday. In that picture, his eyes held warmth that now felt like a memory of summer in the dead of winter. But that warmth, looking at it now under these harsh hospital lights, felt more like frostbite. You see, my story with David didn't begin in that emergency room. It started 37 years earlier when I held him for the first time in this very hospital, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine with the kind of trust that breaks your heart and rebuilds it simultaneously. I was 35 and alone. His father had left before David took his first breath, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility. I named him David because it means beloved, and he was. Oh, how he was beloved. For years, I worked double shifts as a seamstress in the garment district, my fingers bleeding from needle pricks, my back aching from hunching over sewing machines in poorly ventilated workshops. Every dollar I earned went toward giving David what I never had: piano lessons, baseball uniforms, textbooks that weren't falling apart. I wanted him to have choices, opportunities, a future that stretched beyond the narrow confines of our small apartment. My life became a litany of sacrifices I never counted, only gave. I remember those endless nights when David was in high school, staying up until 3 in the morning to help him with his college applications, while my own eyes burned from exhaustion. I'd hand over my last paycheck to cover his SAT prep courses, surviving on instant ramen and day-old bread from the bakery down the street. "Mom, I'll pay you back someday," he'd say, always rushing out the door to meet friends whose parents drove them in cars I could never afford. "I promise when I'm successful, you'll never have to worry about money again." Those promises felt like gospel then. I believed every word. David did well in college, graduating with a business degree that cost me every penny of my savings and most of my retirement fund. But success, as it turned out, came with a price I hadn't anticipated. The more money he made working at a finance firm in Midtown, the less time he had for phone calls. The more his life expanded, the smaller mine seemed to become in his eyes. When he married Laura 3 years ago, I thought I was gaining a daughter. Laura was polished in a way I'd never been, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics company and spoke in a clipped tone that made every conversation feel like a business meeting. Their wedding was held at a venue in the Hamptons that I couldn't pronounce the name of correctly. I wore a dress from Macy's clearance rack and felt every thread of its inadequacy as I sat at a table with David's work colleagues, who spoke about investments and portfolios, while I pushed salmon around my plate and wondered why my son hadn't saved me a seat at the family table. The cold silences at holiday dinners began almost immediately. Thanksgiving dinners at their apartment on the Upper East Side became exercises in endurance. Laura would serve meals that looked like magazine photographs, perfectly arranged, beautiful, and somehow missing the warmth that makes food feel like love. I was treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, invisible in conversations about their European vacations and home renovations. It was as if I had become a ghost in my own son's life. Once, when my rent was raised by $200 and I was struggling to make ends meet on my small Social Security check, I gathered the courage to ask David for help. We were sitting in a coffee shop near his office, and I could see him checking his phone even as I explained my situation. "Mom, you're always asking for something." His voice was sharp, impatient. "Laura and I have our own bills. We just bought the apartment and we're trying to save for a house in Westchester. Maybe you should look into senior housing or something more appropriate for your budget." Appropriate for my budget. As if my financial struggles were a character flaw rather than the result of decades spent ensuring he never had to worry about money. Behind his polite nods hid something that felt like calculation. Every birthday became forgotten. Every Christmas gift arrived late or was replaced with sterile cards signed with just his name. Laura's handwriting, I noticed, but never her signature. When I tried to bring up promises he'd made to help with my medical bills, he'd shrug and change the subject. "I never promised that, Mom. You must be misremembering." The conversations would evaporate into thin air, leaving me wondering if I was losing my memory or if I had simply been blind all these years. The doubt settled in like the thick Manhattan winter. Gray, heavy, and impossible to shake. Could love feel this cold? Or had I been fooling myself about what David and I really meant to each other? Have you ever questioned whether someone you love sees you as a person or just as a resource to be managed? The realization crept in slowly, like water through a cracked ceiling. Every interaction began to feel transactional. When David called, it was usually to ask about something: where I'd put his childhood baseball cards, whether I still had his college textbooks, if I could babysit his neighbor's dog while they were out of town. Never just to talk, never just to hear my voice. The microaggressions accumulated like snowflakes, each one insignificant alone, but together creating a blizzard of neglect that left me numb with cold. My last birthday passed without a phone call. When I developed a persistent cough that kept me up at nights for weeks, I mentioned it to David during one of our brief conversations. "Have you been to the doctor?" he asked, but his tone suggested he was already thinking about something else. "I can't afford the copay right now," I admitted. "Well, maybe you should figure that out, Mom. I can't be responsible for managing your health." Managing my health. As if asking for basic concern was an unreasonable burden. The final blow came in November, 2 months before that Christmas night in the hospital. I'd been having trouble understanding my Medicare paperwork. The forms were confusing, full of medical codes and policy numbers that swam together before my tired eyes. When I called David to ask if he could help me sort through them, Laura answered his phone. "Margaret," she said, using my first name like a weapon, "David is very busy with work right now. Maybe you could ask someone at the senior center to help you with that kind of thing." Someone at the senior center. Not her husband. Not my son. Someone else. Anyone else. That night, I lay in my narrow bed listening to the couple upstairs arguing and wondered when I had become such an inconvenience to the person I'd spent my entire adult life loving. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of unwanted realizations. But I wasn't prepared for what I discovered next. It was a gray Tuesday morning in December when I received a call from New York Presbyterian Hospital's Financial Services Department. A woman with a kind voice explained that there had been some confusion about my emergency contact information. "We have your son David listed as your healthcare proxy, but when we contacted him about your recent emergency room visit for chest pains, he seemed surprised. He mentioned that he thought your insurance would cover everything and that he wasn't responsible for any bills." My recent emergency room visit. But I'd never been to the emergency room recently. Or had I? The confusion in my mind was becoming more frequent. small gaps in memory that I'd been attributing to stress and poor sleep. But this was different. This was something concrete, something documented in hospital records that I couldn't recall. Can you tell me when this visit occurred? I asked. November 15th, Mrs. Henderson. You were brought in by ambulance after a neighbor found you unconscious in your hallway. Mrs. Hernandez. My neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, from apartment 4A. A kind woman who had moved from Puerto Rico decades ago and always checked on me when she hadn't heard my television in a few days. She must have used her key, the spare I'd given her for emergencies, and found me collapsed. But I had no memory of this at all. The realization terrified me more than any physical ailment could. I called David immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. Mom? What's wrong now? His voice carried that familiar note of exasperation. David, the hospital called. They said I was brought in unconscious last month and you were contacted? A long pause. Too long. Yeah, they called me. But you were fine, remember? You just got dehydrated or something. Laura said we shouldn't worry you by making a big deal out of it. Laura said. Not we decided. Not I thought. Laura said. But I don't remember any of this happening. Well, that's probably for the best, Mom. Why upset yourself over something that's already resolved? Already resolved. My unconscious body in a hospital hallway was already resolved. That afternoon, I took the subway down to the hospital and asked to speak with someone about my medical records. A social worker named Patricia, a woman about my son's age with tired eyes and gentle hands, sat with me in a small office that smelled like coffee and industrial carpet. Mrs. Henderson, I'm glad you came in. I actually tried to reach you about this visit, but the phone number we had on file was disconnected. My phone number disconnected, but my phone was working fine. Let me check something, Patricia said, pulling up my records on her computer. After a few moments, she looked up with concern creasing her forehead. It appears that your emergency contact information was changed during your last visit. Your son David updated your address and phone number. According to this, you've been moved to an assisted living facility in Queens. My blood ran cold. I've never lived in Queens. I've been in the same apartment for 12 years. Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like recognition, the kind of recognition that comes from seeing too many similar stories. Mrs. Henderson, I think we need to have a longer conversation. What she told me in that small, fluorescent-lit office changed everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son. David hadn't just been negligent about my medical care. He had been actively managing it without my knowledge or consent. He'd updated my contact information to reflect an assisted living facility I'd never seen, let alone lived in. He'd authorized changes to my Medicare coverage that reduced my benefits and increased my out-of-pocket costs. And there was more. Your son contacted our financial office about your medical bills, Patricia explained gently. He wanted to make sure that nothing was being charged to him personally. He mentioned that he was concerned about protecting his own assets from any medical debt you might incur. Protecting his own assets from his mother's medical debt, from the woman who had worked her fingers raw to pay for his education, his opportunities, his entire life up until this moment. But the worst revelation came when Patricia pulled up a note that had been added to my file during that November visit I couldn't remember. It says here that your son David expressed concerns about your mental capacity. He suggested that you might be experiencing dementia and might need to be declared incompetent to handle your own affairs. The room started spinning. Incompetent to handle my own affairs. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't even abandonment. This was something calculated, something planned. What does that mean exactly? I whispered. It means that if a doctor agreed with his assessment, David could be granted legal guardianship over your medical and financial decisions. It means he could make choices about your care, your living situation, your money, all without consulting you. My money. The small savings account I'd managed to rebuild after paying for David's college. My apartment. My independence. My life. Everything I still had could be taken away with a doctor's signature on a form. I walked home from the hospital that day in a daze, the December wind cutting through my thin coat like accusations. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different somehow, as if I were seeing them through the eyes of a stranger. Every face I passed on the sidewalk seemed to be looking at me with pity, as if they could see the truth written across my features. Here walks a woman whose own son is planning to erase her. When I reached my apartment building, Mrs. Hernandez was checking her mail in the lobby. She looked up at me with genuine warmth, the kind of expression I realized I hadn't seen from my own family in years. Margaret, mija, how are you feeling? You look pale. Mija, my daughter. In her kindness, she claimed me as family more than my own blood ever had. Mrs. Hernandez, can I ask you something? That day in November when you found me in the hallway, her face clouded with worry. Margaret, that scared me so much. You were just lying there, and I couldn't wake you up. The paramedics said you'd been there for hours, maybe all night. When we got to the hospital, they asked me to call your emergency contact, and I gave them your son's number from the list you gave me. Did you talk to David directly? No, I spoke to a woman. His wife, I think. She said they would meet us at the hospital, but then I never saw them. When they discharged you the next day, you seemed confused about what had happened. You said David had been there, but the nurses told me no family had visited. No family had visited. My son, informed that his mother had been found unconscious and hospitalized, had not bothered to come. Instead, his wife had assured my neighbor that they would handle everything, and then they had done nothing except change my records to reflect a life I wasn't living. That night, alone in my apartment with only the sound of the radiator for company, I sat on my small couch and stared at the photograph of David and me in Central Park. His smile, which had once seemed so genuine, now looked calculated somehow. Had he been performing even then? Had he ever truly seen me as more than an obligation, a burden, something to be managed and eventually disposed of? I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for his behavior. He's busy with work. He has his own family now. Laura helps him see things differently. All the ways I'd convinced myself that his growing distance was natural, normal, just the way adult children separate from their parents. But this wasn't separation. This was erasure. I found myself trembling as I held that photograph, my hands shaking not from age or illness, but from a rage so profound I didn't know I was capable of feeling it. The David in the picture, young and smiling, seemed to be mocking me. Had I raised a son who could look at his mother and see only a problem to be solved? The porcelain teacup I'd been holding slipped from my numb fingers and crashed against the hardwood floor, shattering into pieces that reflected the overhead light like tiny mirrors. Each fragment showed a distorted version of my face, broken, scattered, but still there, still real. I knelt down to clean up the pieces, and that's when the tears finally came. Not the gentle weeping of sadness, but the harsh, ugly crying of betrayal. My chest heaved with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, somewhere in my bones where the knowledge of my son's deception had taken root like a cancer. How long had I been living a lie? How many conversations, how many moments of seeming kindness from David had been carefully orchestrated performances designed to keep me compliant while he and Laura planned their next move? As I sat there on my knees, surrounded by broken ceramic, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. I was going to fight back. But first, I had to understand exactly what I was fighting against. The next morning, I called David's office. His secretary, a young woman with a cheerful voice, informed me that Mr. Henderson was in meetings all day, but would return my call when possible. He didn't call back. I tried his cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me about something important regarding my medical care. When he still hadn't called by evening, I tried again. This time, Laura answered. "Hello, Margaret." Her voice was cool, professional, the way she might greet a telemarketer. David's phone died, and he asked me to handle his calls tonight. I need to speak with David about some medical records that don't seem accurate. What kind of medical records? The question was too quick, too sharp. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Records that show I'm living somewhere I've never been, and that show David making medical decisions without consulting me. A long pause. I could hear Laura breathing, thinking, calculating. "Margaret, David and I have been very concerned about your memory lately. You've been confused about a lot of things, and we thought it would be better if we handled some of your medical affairs until you're feeling more like yourself, until I'm feeling more like myself. As if the problem was my confusion, rather than their deception. I'm not confused about where I live, Laura. I'm not confused about conversations I haven't had or decisions I haven't made." Well, that's exactly the kind of thing someone who's confused would say, isn't it? The words hit me like a physical blow. This was how it worked then. Any objection I raised to their management of my life would be used as evidence of my incompetence. Any attempt to defend myself would be twisted into proof that I needed defending against. I want to speak with David. Tonight. I'll let him know you called. But Margaret, I really think you should consider talking to someone professional about these concerns. Sometimes when people get older, they start to feel paranoid about the people who are trying to help them. Paranoid. There it was. The word that would justify anything they decided to do to me. I hung up the phone with my heart pounding and my hands shaking with an emotion I could barely name. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something closer to terror. They had created a narrative about me, confused, paranoid, incompetent, that would justify whatever they decided to do next. And every time I protested, I would be feeding into that narrative. But I wasn't confused, I wasn't paranoid, and I certainly wasn't incompetent. I was a 72-year-old woman who had survived the death of her husband, raised a son alone in one of the most expensive cities in the world, worked until her body gave out, and managed to maintain her independence despite every obstacle life had thrown at her. I was not going down without a fight. That night, I began documenting everything. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, every date, every inconsistency in their story. I gathered my medical records, my financial statements, anything that proved I was competent to manage my own affairs. And I called Mrs. Hernandez. "Mija, what's wrong? You sound upset." I told her everything. About the changed records, about David's plans to have me declared incompetent, about Laura's accusations of paranoia. I expected her to be shocked, but instead, she nodded with the weary recognition of someone who had seen this story before. "My sister in the Bronx, the same thing happened to her. Her daughter wanted to sell her house and put her in a home, made her sound crazy to every doctor, every lawyer. But you know what my sister did? What? She fought. She got her own lawyer, got her own doctor, got her own life back. It took time, but she did it. Her own lawyer, her own doctor, her own life. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't despair or rage. I felt hope. Mrs. Hernandez, would you be willing to help me? Mija, what do you think I'm already doing?" The next morning, Mrs. Hernandez accompanied me to a legal aid clinic in Manhattan, where I met with an attorney named Sarah Rodriguez, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Sarah was younger than David, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Henderson, what you're describing is more common than you might think. Adult children who believe they're entitled to their parents' assets sometimes engage in what we call anticipatory inheritance. They start managing their parents' affairs not in their parents' best interests, but in their own. Anticipatory inheritance. There was a name for what David was doing to me. What are my options? First, we need to establish your competency beyond any doubt. I'm going to refer you to a geriatric psychiatrist who can evaluate you and provide documentation that you're fully capable of making your own decisions. Second, we need to revoke any medical or financial power of attorney that David might have obtained. Based on what you've told me, it sounds like he might have gotten some of these documents signed during your hospital visit when you were medicated and confused. But I don't remember signing anything. That's exactly the problem. If someone signs legal documents while they're under the influence of medication or in a state of confusion, those documents aren't valid. We can challenge them. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. There were laws to protect people like me. There were people who understood what was happening and knew how to fight it. But Sarah's next words reminded me that this wouldn't be easy. "Mrs. Henderson, you should be prepared for your son and daughter-in-law to fight back. Once they realize you're challenging their authority, they might escalate their claims about your mental state. They might try to have you hospitalized again or force a competency hearing. This could get very ugly before it gets better." Ugly. The word seemed inadequate for what I was already experiencing. "What's the alternative?" I asked. "Let them erase me?" Sarah smiled, and I saw in her expression something I hadn't seen in my son's eyes for years. Respect. "No, Mrs. Henderson, we don't let them erase you." The psychiatric evaluation took place the following week in a small office on the Upper East Side that smelled like lavender and coffee. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a woman about my age with silver hair and gentle hands who spent 3 hours with me, asking questions, giving me puzzles to solve, testing my memory and reasoning skills. "Mrs. Henderson, you're certainly not suffering from dementia or any significant cognitive impairment," she told me at the end of our session. "Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are sharp, and your judgment appears sound. If anything, you seem to be suffering from stress and depression related to family conflicts, which is entirely understandable given what you've told me." She handed me a thick folder of documents. "These are copies of my evaluation and recommendations. I'm also writing a letter that states clearly that in my professional opinion, you are fully competent to make your own medical and financial decisions. Anyone who suggests otherwise would need to provide substantial evidence to contradict this assessment." I held those papers like they were made of gold. Documentation of my sanity, my competence, my right to exist in the world as myself, rather than as David's version of me. But even as I felt victorious, I knew the hardest part was still coming. I had to confront David directly. I called him that evening, and surprisingly, he answered on the first ring. "Mom, I was just about to call you. How are you feeling?" His voice was warm, concerned, the voice of the son I remembered from years past. For a moment, I almost believed that I had been wrong about everything, that there was some innocent explanation for all the confusion and pain. Almost. "David, I need to see you. We need to talk about some things face to face." "Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? You sound upset." "I'm fine. Are you free tomorrow evening?" Let me check with Laura. Can we meet somewhere public? Maybe that coffee shop near your apartment. Public. So there would be witnesses to whatever happened next. That's fine. 7 o'clock? Perfect. Mom, I want you to know that Laura and I love you very much. Whatever's bothering you, we'll work it out together. Together. The word felt like a lie, but I realized that I wanted desperately for it to be true. Despite everything, despite all the evidence of his betrayal, I still wanted to believe that my son loved me. That was my greatest weakness, and as it turned out, the source of whatever strength I had left. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few students with laptops and an elderly couple sharing a piece of pie. I chose a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard, but where there would still be people around to witness our conversation. David arrived exactly on time, looking polished in his winter coat and carrying the leather briefcase I'd bought him for his college graduation. He kissed my cheek when he sat down, and for a moment, he was just my son again. Mom, you look good. Have you lost weight? Small talk. The careful dance we'd been doing for years around the things we really needed to discuss. David, I went to the hospital to review my medical records. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Caution, maybe, or calculation. Oh? Why would you need to do that? Because I found out that my emergency contact information had been changed without my knowledge. I found out that you told them I was living in an assisted living facility in Queens. I found out that you've been making decisions about my medical care without consulting me. Mom, you were unconscious when they brought you in. Someone had to make decisions. But that's not what happened, is it? You changed my information before I was brought in. You've been planning this. He leaned back in his chair, and I saw him transform before my eyes. The warm sun disappeared, replaced by the cold businessman who saw me as a problem to be managed. Mom, Laura and I have been very worried about you. You've been confused, forgetting things, making poor decisions about your health and your finances. We thought it would be better if we helped manage some of these issues before they became more serious. What poor decisions about my finances? Well, for example, you're still living in that expensive apartment when you could be in a much more affordable senior community. You're spending money on things you don't need instead of saving for your future medical care. It's my money, David, and it's my life. But Mom, when you get sicker, and you will get sicker, who do you think is going to have to deal with the consequences? Laura and I will be the ones trying to figure out how to pay for your care while you're sitting in a nursing home wondering why you didn't plan better. The mask had slipped completely now. This wasn't about concern for my well-being. This was about protecting David and Laura from the inconvenience of having to support me in my old age. So you decided to take control of my affairs before I could mess them up? We decided to help you before things got out of hand. But if you're going to be paranoid about people who are trying to help you, then maybe you're proving our point about your mental state. There it was again. Paranoid. Any resistance to their management would be used as evidence of my incompetence. But this time, I was ready. I opened my purse and placed Dr. Walsh's evaluation on the table between us. This is a psychiatric evaluation I had done last week. It states that I am fully competent to make my own medical and financial decisions. It also states that anyone who claims otherwise would need substantial evidence to prove their case. David's eyes widened as he scanned the first page of the document. I had never seen him look genuinely surprised before, and I realized that he had never expected me to fight back. Mom, why would you do something like this without talking to us first? Because, David, I'm not required to talk to anyone before getting my own medical care, because these are my decisions to make, not yours. But Mom, just because one doctor says you're competent doesn't mean... It means that legally, you have no right to make medical decisions for me unless I'm incapacitated and unable to make them myself. It means that any documents you might have gotten me to sign while I was medicated and confused can be challenged in court. His face went pale. Mom, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Laura and I were just trying to help. No, David. Laura and I were trying to help ourselves to whatever assets I have left before I die. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire. Once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. That's not true, Mom. We love you. If you love me, then treat me like a person instead of a problem. Stop making decisions about my life without consulting me. Stop changing my medical records. Stop planning for my incompetence like it's inevitable. And if we don't? The question revealed everything. If we don't comply with your demands, what are you going to do about it? He was calling my bluff, assuming I was too weak, too dependent, too desperate for his affection to actually stand up to him. He was wrong. Then, I'll revoke any power of attorney you think you have. I'll change my emergency contacts. I'll find a lawyer and challenge every decision you've made on my behalf. And if you continue to tell people I'm incompetent, I'll sue you for defamation. David stared at me for a long moment, as if he were seeing me for the first time, or maybe he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Mom, you're making a mistake. We're the only family you have. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Submit to our management, or lose us entirely. 6 months ago, that threat would have destroyed me. The fear of being completely alone would have made me fold, apologize, beg for forgiveness for daring to question their authority over my life. But sitting there in that coffee shop looking at my son's cold eyes, I realized something that changed everything. I was already alone. I had been alone for years, living with the illusion that David's occasional phone calls and Laura's polite but distant behavior constituted family. The truth was that they had already abandoned me emotionally. They were just waiting for me to die or become incapacitated so they could abandon me practically as well. David, if the only way I can have you in my life is to give you control over my life, then I don't really have you anyway, do I? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We both knew the truth. He gathered his coat and stood up from the table. Mom, I hope you'll reconsider this. Laura and I don't want to fight with you, but we're not going to stand by and watch you make decisions that put everyone at risk. Everyone. Not just me. Everyone. As if my choices about my own life somehow threatened them. Goodbye, David. This doesn't have to be goodbye, Mom. It can be, see you later, if you'll just be reasonable. Reasonable. Submit. Comply. Disappear quietly. I watched him walk out of the coffee shop and realized that I might never see my son again. The thought should have broken my heart, but instead I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to worry about managing David's expectations or making excuses for his behavior or pretending that his version of love was enough to sustain me. I was free to figure out who I was without him. But David and Laura weren't finished with me yet. 2 days later, I received a phone call from Adult Protective Services. A woman named Helen Martinez contacted me to schedule a home visit to assess my living situation and mental state. Mrs. Henderson, we received a report from a family member expressing concern about your well-being. A report from a family member. David had escalated exactly as Sarah Rodriguez had predicted. What kind of concerns? The report suggests that you might be living in unsafe conditions and that you might be suffering from paranoid delusions that are causing you to reject help from people who care about you. Paranoid delusions. They even had the language down perfectly. Ms. Martinez, I just had a psychiatric evaluation done that proves I'm competent to make my own decisions. I'd be happy to provide you with those records. That's helpful, Mrs. Henderson, but we're still required to complete our own assessment. Can I schedule a time to visit your apartment? Of course. When would you like to come? We made an appointment for the following Thursday. I spent the intervening days cleaning my apartment more thoroughly than I had in years, organizing my medical and financial records, and preparing to defend my right to exist independently. Mrs. Hernandez helped me understand what to expect. Mija, they're going to look for any excuse to say you can't take care of yourself. Make sure the apartment is clean, but not too clean. They'll think someone else is cleaning for you. Make sure you have food in the refrigerator, but not too much. They'll think you're hoarding. Be friendly, but not too friendly. They'll think you're manic. The double bind was exhausting. Any behavior could be interpreted as evidence of incompetence if someone was determined to see it that way. Helen Martinez turned out to be a tired-looking woman in her 40s who clearly had too many cases and not enough time to handle them properly. She spent about 30 minutes in my apartment, asked me questions about my daily routine, checked my refrigerator and bathroom, and made notes on a clipboard. Mrs. Henderson, your apartment is clean and you seem to be taking care of yourself adequately. However, I do need to ask you about the report we received regarding your relationship with your son and daughter-in-law. What would you like to know? The report suggests that you've become suspicious of their attempts to help you and that you've accused them of trying to steal from you or control your medical care. Can you tell me about these concerns? I handed her copies of all my documentation, the medical records showing the unauthorized changes, Dr. Walsh's psychiatric evaluation, Sarah Rodriguez's legal assessment of the situation. Ms. Martinez, these documents show that my son has been making medical and financial decisions without my consent. I'm not suffering from paranoid delusions. I'm responding appropriately to actual attempts to take control of my affairs. She spent 20 minutes reviewing the paperwork, and I watched her expression change as she read. Mrs. Henderson, these are very serious allegations. Have you reported this to the police? I've reported it to my attorney. We're handling it through legal channels. I see. Well, based on my assessment, you're clearly competent to make your own decisions and live independently. I'll be closing this case and recommending no further action. She paused at the door as she was leaving. Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that what's happening to you isn't uncommon. Adult children often believe they know what's best for their parents, and sometimes that belief leads them to overstep appropriate boundaries. You were right to fight back. You were right to fight back. 6 words that validated everything I'd been feeling and fearing. But even as I celebrated this victory, I knew David and Laura would try something else. People who are determined to control you don't give up easily when their first attempts fail. I was right. The next attack came through my apartment building. I received a notice from the management company stating that they had received complaints from concerned family members about my ability to live safely in my unit. They were requiring me to undergo an independent living assessment or face eviction. This was a new level of cruelty. David and Laura were now trying to take away my home. I called Sarah Rodriguez immediately. Mrs. Henderson, they can't evict you based on unsubstantiated complaints from family members. We're going to fight this aggressively. But what if they keep finding new ways to attack me? What if they never stop? Then we keep fighting until they realize the cost of attacking you is higher than the cost of leaving you alone. The cost of attacking me. I liked the way that sounded. For too many years, I had been a cost-free target for David and Laura's manipulation. It was time for that to change. Sarah filed an immediate injunction against the eviction proceedings and sent a letter to David and Laura's attorney, informing them that any further harassment of me would result in a lawsuit for elder abuse, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The harassment stopped, not because David and Laura had developed consciences, but because they finally understood that I had developed teeth. For the first time in years, my phone stopped ringing with demands disguised as concern. My mailbox stopped filling with documents I hadn't requested from doctors I'd never met. The weight of constant vigilance began to lift from my shoulders. And in that space, that quiet space that opened up when I stopped having to defend myself constantly, I began to remember who I was before I became David's mother. I had been someone once. Before I spent 37 years defining myself entirely in relationship to my son's needs and demands, I had been a person with interests, dreams, preferences, opinions that mattered to me regardless of whether they mattered to anyone else. The rediscovery began with small things. I started buying clothes I liked instead of clothes that were practical and inexpensive. I subscribed to magazines I enjoyed instead of just the ones with coupons. I bought plants for my apartment, not because they served any purpose, but because they were beautiful and they made me happy. Mrs. Hernandez noticed the changes immediately. Mija, you look different. Younger, like you're becoming yourself again. Becoming myself again. Was it possible to reclaim an identity that had been buried for decades under the weight of someone else's expectations? I decided to find out. I enrolled in a painting class at the community center near Lincoln Park. I hadn't held a brush since high school art class, but something about the smell of the paint and the texture of the canvas under my fingers felt like coming home. The instructor, a woman named Catherine who wore paint-stained smocks and laughed easily, encouraged us to paint not what we saw, but what we felt. Don't try to make it look like something, she told us. Just let the colors tell you what they want to become. My first painting was terrible by any conventional standard. The colors were muddy, the shapes were undefined. It looked like nothing so much as the visual representation of confusion, but it was mine. Every brushstroke was a choice I had made without consulting anyone, without worrying about whether it was practical or appropriate or what anyone else would think of it. I loved it. I hung it on the wall in my living room, right where David and Laura would have seen it if they ever visited. Which, of course, they didn't. Their absence, which should have felt like punishment, instead felt like freedom. I started taking long walks through Central Park, not because I needed the exercise, but because I enjoyed watching the seasons change. I discovered that I loved the way snow looked on the bare branches of trees, the way spring flowers pushed through the hard ground with stubborn determination, the way the summer light fell through leaves and painted everything gold. I had been so busy surviving for so many years that I had forgotten how to simply exist in the world as myself. One afternoon in late spring, I was sitting on a bench in the park reading a book. Not a self-help book about aging or managing difficult family relationships, just a novel I'd picked up because the cover was beautiful. When my phone rang, David's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the woman I had been 6 months ago who would have answered immediately, desperate for any contact with him. That woman would have accepted any terms for his attention, would have apologized for standing up for herself, would have agreed to whatever conditions he set for maintaining some version of a relationship. But that woman was gone. I let the call go to voicemail. An hour later, sitting in my apartment with a cup of tea and my feet up on the ottoman I'd bought myself for no reason except that I wanted it, I listened to his message. Hi, Mom. It's David. I know we left things in a difficult place, and I've been thinking about our conversation a lot. Laura and I would like to have lunch with you soon so we can work things out. I think we all said some things we didn't mean. and it's time to move forward. Call me back when you get this. Work things out. Move forward. The language of someone who wanted to reset the relationship back to the way it had been before I started defending myself. Some things we didn't mean, as if his attempts to have me declared incompetent had been said in anger rather than executed with careful planning. I saved the message without returning the call. 3 days later, he called again. This time, his tone was different. Less conciliatory, more frustrated. Mom, I don't understand why you're not returning my calls. Look, I know you're angry, but this is getting ridiculous. We're family. Family works through their problems. They don't just stop talking to each other. Call me back. We're family. The words that had once been my weakness. The claim that could make me endure any treatment, forgive any betrayal, accept any condition for maintaining the connection, now sounded hollow. Being family meant something. It meant treating each other with love, respect, consideration. It meant protecting each other's well-being, not exploiting each other's vulnerabilities. It meant honoring each other's autonomy, not attempting to erase it. David and Laura had violated every principle of family that mattered to me. The shared DNA and decades of history didn't create an obligation for me to continue participating in my own diminishment. I deleted the message without saving it. The third call came a week later, and this time it was Laura. Margaret, this is Laura. I'm calling because David is really upset about the situation between you two, and I think some things need to be said. We understand that you felt like we were overstepping boundaries and we're sorry if our attempts to help you came across as controlling. But Margaret, cutting David out of your life is hurting him, and it's not healthy for you either. Family is all we have in this world, and you're going to regret burning these bridges when you're older, and you really need us. When I'm older, and I really need them. The threat wrapped in concern, the implication that my current period of independence was temporary, and that eventually I would have no choice but to accept whatever terms they offered. But there was something else in Laura's message, something I had never heard from her before. Uncertainty. For the first time since I'd known her, Laura sounded like she wasn't completely sure of her position. The confident dismissal was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like respect. They had finally realized that I was capable of living without them, and that realization was apparently more unsettling than they had expected. I saved the message, but I didn't return the call. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made plans that had nothing to do with David or Laura or anyone else's expectations of what my life should look like. I booked a trip to Boston. I had always wanted to visit the Museum of Fine Arts there, had always been curious about the city where the American Revolution had begun, but during David's childhood, every extra dollar had gone toward his needs. And later, when he was independent, I had somehow never given myself permission to spend money on something as frivolous as tourism. But I wasn't David's mother anymore, at least not in the way I had been for 37 years. I was Margaret Henderson, 72 years old, competent to make her own decisions, and perfectly capable of taking herself on a trip to Boston. The museum was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I spent an entire day wandering through galleries full of paintings that made me understand why I had felt so drawn to watercolors and oils in my community center art class. These artists had taken their feelings and their observations and their experiences and transformed them into something beautiful, something that could speak to strangers across centuries. Standing in front of a Monet painting of water lilies, I understood something about my own life that I had never seen clearly before. The beauty wasn't in the perfect representation of what the lilies actually looked like. The beauty was in the artist's particular way of seeing them, the individual vision that transformed ordinary pond flowers into something transcendent. I had spent so many years trying to be the mother David wanted, the person Laura could tolerate, the version of myself that would be acceptable to their vision of family. But I had never asked myself what my own vision looked like, what beauty I might create if I stopped trying to fit into someone else's frame. That night, in my hotel room overlooking Boston Harbor, I called Mrs. Hernandez. Mija, how is your trip? Are you having a good time? I'm having a wonderful time. Mrs. Hernandez, can I ask you something? When your sister fought to keep control of her life, did she ever regret it? Did she ever wish she had just let her daughter make the decisions? Margaret, that's a hard question. There were times when she was lonely, times when she wondered if fighting was worth it. But you know what she told me? She said that being lonely as herself was better than being surrounded by people as someone else's version of her. Being lonely as herself was better than being surrounded by people as someone else's version of her. Those words stayed with me as I walked the Freedom Trail the next day, as I toured Paul Revere's house and stood in the Old North Church where the signal lanterns had been hung. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. A simple code that had launched a revolution. What was my signal? What was the message I was trying to send? Not just to David and Laura, but to myself. 1 if by submission, 2 if by independence. I chose independence. When I returned to New York, I found a letter from David in my mailbox. Not an email or a text message, but an actual handwritten letter on his company stationery. "Dear Mom," it began. "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship and the mistakes I've made. I realize now that Laura and I approached your situation in the wrong way. We were scared about your health and your future, and we let that fear drive us to make decisions that should have been yours to make. I'm sorry for that. I want to try to rebuild our relationship on better terms. Would you be willing to have dinner with us so we can start over?" Start over. The phrase was appealing in its simplicity, but I had lived long enough to know that relationships don't restart from zero. They carry forward all the history that came before, all the trust that was broken, all the patterns that were established. David's apology was carefully worded and sounded sincere, but it didn't address the fundamental issue, his belief that he had the right to make decisions about my life based on his assessment of what was best for me. I could forgive the mistakes he had made if I believed he understood why they were mistakes. But nothing in his letter suggested that he had grappled with the deeper problem of seeing me as someone to be managed rather than someone to be respected. Still, he was my son. Despite everything, I loved him, and I was curious to see whether the changes I had made in myself might lead to changes in our dynamic. I agreed to have dinner with them. We met at a restaurant in Midtown, neutral territory where the stakes felt lower than they would have in either of our homes. David and Laura were already seated when I arrived, and I noticed immediately that they both looked different somehow. Less polished, less certain, more careful. "Mom, you look great," David said as I sat down. "That trip to Boston must have agreed with you." He knew about the trip. Of course he did. He had probably been monitoring my credit card statements or my social media or asking Mrs. Hernandez about my activities. The surveillance that had once felt caring now felt invasive. "I enjoyed it very much," I said simply. "It must have been expensive," Laura added. "Hotels in Boston are so overpriced." There it was. The subtle criticism disguised as observation. The implication that I was being careless with money that they considered partially theirs. "It was worth every penny," I replied. We ordered our food, and for a few minutes the conversation stayed safely in the neutral territory of weather, current events, and restaurant reviews. But eventually, David broached the subject we were all thinking about. "Mom, I meant what I said in my letter. Laura and I want to start fresh with you." "What does starting fresh mean to you, David?" "It means acknowledging that we made mistakes and figuring out how to have a better relationship going forward." "What mistakes do you think you made?" He hesitated, glancing at Laura before answering. "I think we were too aggressive about trying to help you with medical and financial stuff. We should have talked to you more before making changes to your records." "Talk to me more." As if the problem had been insufficient communication, rather than the fundamental assumption that they had the right to make changes to my records at all. "David, do you understand why changing my medical records without my permission was wrong? Because it upset you." "No, David. Because they're my medical records. Because decisions about my medical care are mine to make. Because I'm a competent adult with the right to self-determination." He looked uncomfortable. "Of course, Mom. I know you're competent. I never said you weren't. You told the social worker and adult protective services that I was suffering from paranoid delusions. I was worried about you. Some of the things you were saying seemed what? Seemed like you might be misunderstanding the situation." Even now, even in his apology, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that my perceptions had been accurate. Everything I had accused him of doing, he had actually done. But in his mind, my objections to his behavior were still evidence of misunderstanding rather than appropriate responses to inappropriate actions. "David, what would it look like for you to treat me as an equal in this relationship?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him. "What do you mean? I mean, what would have to change for you to see me as a person whose opinions and preferences matter as much as yours do?" Laura leaned forward. "Margaret, of course your opinions matter. We're not saying they don't. But when my opinions conflict with what you think is best for me, whose opinions take priority?" Another glance between them. This time, Laura answered. "Well, Margaret, sometimes people who are older or who are dealing with health problems don't always see the big picture clearly. Sometimes the people who love them have to make difficult decisions for their own good. For their own good." The phrase that justifies every paternalistic overreach, every violation of autonomy disguised as care. "Laura, if I'm competent to make decisions, and we've established that I am, then for my own good, should be determined by me, not by you. But what if you make bad decisions? Then I make bad decisions. They're my bad decisions to make. Even if those decisions affect other people, there it was. The real issue. Not concern for my well-being, but concern about how my choices might impact them. How do my decisions about where I live and how I manage my medical care affect you and David? Laura's mask slipped for just a moment. Well, if you don't plan properly for your future care needs, David and I will be the ones who have to deal with the consequences. No, you won't. You'll be the ones who choose to deal with the consequences. There's a difference. David looked frustrated. Mom, you can't just pretend that family members don't have obligations to each other. You're absolutely right, David. Family members do have obligations to each other. They have obligations to treat each other with love and respect, to honor each other's autonomy, to support each other's happiness and well-being. Which of those obligations do you feel I haven't met in our relationship? He didn't answer, because we both knew the answer. I had spent 37 years meeting every obligation I could imagine and several I should never have accepted. The problem wasn't that I had failed in my obligations as his mother. The problem was that he had never understood his obligations as my son. The dinner ended awkwardly, with promises to keep talking that all of us knew were unlikely to be fulfilled. As we stood outside the restaurant, David made one last attempt. Mom, I know we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I hope you'll stay in touch. I worry about you. David, if you want to have a relationship with me, I'm open to that. But it has to be a relationship between equals. I'm not available to be managed or monitored or treated like a child who needs supervision. And if there comes a time when you do need help, then I'll ask for it. And if I don't ask for it, you can offer it. But you can't take control away from me just because you think I need help. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't really understand. In his mind, people my age were inevitably going to become incompetent. And when that happened, he would need to step in. The only question was timing. But I had news for him. Incompetence isn't inevitable. Dependency isn't guaranteed. And even if those things do come, they don't automatically transfer authority over my life to him. I walked home through the streets of Manhattan, past the late-night diners and the glowing windows of apartments where other families were probably having their own complicated conversations about love and control and the price of caring. When I reached my building, Mrs. Hernandez was sitting in the lobby reading a magazine. Mija, how was your dinner? Complicated. Did they understand what you were trying to tell them? I don't think so, but I think I understand what I was trying to tell them. And what was that? That I'm not their mother anymore. At least not in the way I used to be. She looked confused. Of course you're still his mother. I'm still the woman who gave birth to him, yes. But I'm not still the person whose life is entirely organized around his needs and wants. I'm not still willing to sacrifice my autonomy for his comfort or my dignity for his convenience. Mrs. Hernandez smiled. Ah, you're still his mother, but now you're also yourself. Exactly. I was still his mother, but now I was also myself. That night, December 23rd, I went to bed early with a book I was enjoying and a feeling of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't expecting any visitors, wasn't waiting for phone calls, wasn't managing anyone else's emotions or expectations. I was just Margaret, reading a book in her own bed in her own apartment, accountable to no one but herself. I should have known it was too good to last. The chest pain started around midnight. Sharp, radiating, unmistakable. This time, I knew immediately what it was and how serious it might be. I called 911 calmly, got dressed in clothes that would be easy for medical personnel to work with, and gathered my insurance cards and medical records. I had learned over the past 6 months to take care of myself efficiently and without panic. The paramedics were professional and kind, asking questions about my symptoms and medications as we made our way through the nearly empty streets toward the hospital. I found myself thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that if this was the end, I was ready for it. Not because I wanted to die, but because I had finally remembered how to live. The emergency room was quieter than it had been during my previous visit. Staffed by skeleton crews managing the overnight shift, I was taken quickly to a bed in the cardiac unit, where nurses attached monitoring equipment and started an IV line. Mrs. Henderson, we're going to run some tests and see what's going on, the doctor explained. Do you have family members we should contact? I hesitated. The old me would have automatically provided David's number, would have assumed that he should be notified of any medical emergency. But the new me had to think about whether I actually wanted him there, whether his presence would be helpful or harmful to my recovery. Let me think about that, I told the doctor. Think about that. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have imagined there was anything to think about. Of course my son should be contacted. Of course he should be involved. But 6 months ago, I hadn't understood that medical emergencies don't automatically cancel your right to choose who gets access to you when you're vulnerable. The EKG showed signs of cardiac stress, but not a full heart attack. The blood tests would take a few hours to process. In the meantime, I was stable but would need to remain for observation. Around 3 a.m., I was dozing lightly when I heard familiar voices in the hallway outside my room. "We're her family," Laura was saying to someone, probably a nurse. "Her son and daughter-in-law. We got a call that she'd been brought in, but I hadn't told them to call anyone," which meant that either someone at the hospital had taken it upon themselves to contact David or, "I'm sorry, but visiting hours don't start until 8 a.m., and the patient specifically requested that we check with her before allowing any visitors." The patient specifically requested. I hadn't made that request, which meant that some perceptive nurse had made it for me, someone who understood that not all family visits are welcome. "Look, we understand about visiting hours," David's voice now, using his professional tone, "but this is an emergency situation. We need to make sure she's getting appropriate care. We need to make sure she's getting appropriate care." As if the medical professionals weren't capable of providing that without his supervision. "Sir, I understand your concern, but Mrs. Henderson is receiving excellent care and she's stable. If you'd like to wait until morning, I'm sure." "We're not waiting until morning. She's 72 years old and she's had a heart attack. We need to see her now." A heart attack. But the doctor had specifically told me it wasn't a heart attack. Either David was exaggerating for dramatic effect, or someone had given him incorrect information, or he was simply assuming the worst-case scenario because it served his purposes. I pressed the call button for the nurse. A young woman appeared within moments. The same voice I'd heard in the hallway, I realized. "Mrs. Henderson, how are you feeling? Do you need anything for pain?" "I'm feeling fine, thank you." But I overheard the conversation in the hallway, and I wanted to clarify something about visitors. She looked slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry about that. Your son and daughter-in-law are here, and they're quite insistent about seeing you. I told them that visiting hours don't start until morning, but they seem to think this is an emergency situation that overrides normal policies." What's the normal policy when family members want to visit outside visiting hours? We check with the patient first to see if they want the visit, especially if they're stable and not in immediate danger. And if the patient says no, then we enforce visiting hours and ask the family members to return at an appropriate time. I took a deep breath. 6 months ago, I would have automatically said yes, would have felt guilty for even considering saying no, would have prioritized David and Laura's anxiety over my own need for rest and peace. But 6 months ago, I had been a different person. "I don't want to see them tonight," I said. "I'm tired, I'm stable, and I don't want visitors. Can you please ask them to leave and come back tomorrow during regular visiting hours?" "Of course, Mrs. Henderson. I'll let them know. And when they ask why, please tell them that I made this decision because I'm competent to make my own medical decisions, and I chose to prioritize my rest and recovery." She smiled. "I'll tell them exactly that." I listened to the conversation that followed with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Henderson is resting and doesn't want visitors tonight. She asked me to tell you that she's making this decision because she's competent to make her own medical decisions and she's prioritizing her rest and recovery." "That's ridiculous." Laura's voice sharp with frustration. "She's had a heart attack. She's not thinking clearly." "Ma'am, Mrs. Henderson hasn't had a heart attack. She's experiencing some cardiac stress, but her condition is stable and she's mentally alert and oriented. She has every right to control her own visiting schedule." "Look, nurse, you don't understand the situation." David now, using the tone he probably used with subordinates at work. "Our mother has had some cognitive issues lately, and she's been making poor decisions about her medical care. We need to make sure she's getting appropriate treatment. Sir, I've been caring for your mother for several hours now, and she's shown no signs of cognitive impairment. She's been alert, oriented, and appropriate in all her interactions with medical staff. If you have specific concerns about her treatment, you can speak with her doctor in the morning, but she's receiving excellent care." "We're not leaving," Laura said. "We're going to wait in the family lounge until she changes her mind." "That's your choice, ma'am, but I should let you know that Mrs. Henderson has the right to refuse visitors entirely if that's what she decides she wants." Refuse visitors entirely. The phrase filled me with something close to joy. I had the right to refuse visitors entirely. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, surrounded by exactly the people I wanted to be surrounded by. Medical professionals who saw me as a patient deserving of care rather than a problem to be managed. And the people who had caused me the most stress and anxiety were being kept away by institutional policies designed to protect my well-being. It felt like a miracle. Around 5 a.m., I was awakened by a gentle touch on my shoulder. The nurse, her name tag said Jennifer, was checking my vital signs. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Henderson?" "Much better, rested." "Good. Your son and daughter-in-law are still in the family lounge, by the way. They've been there all night, waiting for me to change my mind, or waiting for visiting hours to begin, or waiting for an opportunity to convince someone that I wasn't competent to make decisions about my own visitors." "Jennifer, can I ask you something?" In your experience, when adult children are this insistent about overriding their parents' expressed wishes, what's usually going on? She was quiet for a moment, probably considering how much she should say. In my experience, it's usually about control rather than care. People who are genuinely caring tend to respect the wishes of the people they're caring for. Control rather than care. Yes, that was exactly right. What happens when visiting hours start? Do I have to see them if I don't want to? Mrs. Henderson, you never have to see anyone you don't want to see. Being in the hospital doesn't take away your right to choose who has access to you. My right to choose who has access to me. Another phrase that felt like a revelation. What if I want to see my son but not my daughter-in-law? Can I make that kind of distinction? Absolutely. It's your room, your recovery, your choice. At 8 a.m., Jennifer returned to let me know that visiting hours had begun and to ask whether I wanted to see David and Laura. I had been thinking about this decision for hours. Part of me wanted to refuse to see them at all, to let them understand what it felt like to be shut out of important moments in someone's life. But another part of me was curious about how David would behave when he couldn't control the terms of our interaction. I'd like to see David alone for 15 minutes, I decided. Not Laura, just David. I'll let them know. A few minutes later, David appeared in my doorway looking haggard and worried. For a moment, I saw him as he had been when he was small. My little boy who came running to me when he was hurt or scared, who trusted me to make everything better. But then he spoke, and the illusion shattered. Mom, what the hell is going on? Why wouldn't you see us last night? And why can't Laura come in now? What the hell is going on? Not, how are you feeling? Or, I was worried about you. His first concern was about my failure to follow the script he had written for this interaction. I'm fine, David. I didn't have a heart attack. I'm stable, and I'm going home today. I didn't want visitors last night because I needed rest, and I don't want Laura here now because I want to have a private conversation with you. A private conversation about what? About whether you've learned anything from the past 6 months. He sat down in the chair beside my bed, and I could see him shift into the mode he used when he was trying to manage difficult clients. Mom, look, I know we've had some disagreements, but when I got the call that you were in the hospital, none of that mattered. All I cared about was getting here to make sure you were okay. Who called you, David? I didn't ask anyone to call you. He looked uncomfortable. The hospital called me. You're listed as my emergency contact. No, David, you're listed as mine. There's a difference. And I specifically told them last night not to contact anyone without checking with me first. Well, someone called me. What does it matter who? What does it matter who? It mattered because it meant that either someone at the hospital had violated my expressed wishes, or David was lying about how he'd learned about my hospitalization. David, have you been monitoring my activities somehow? My credit cards, my medical records, my conversations with neighbors? Mom, that's paranoid. Why would I be monitoring you? Paranoid. The word he always used when I asked questions he didn't want to answer. Because 6 months ago, you and Laura were trying to take control of my medical and financial affairs. Because you had me investigated by Adult Protective Services. Because you tried to get me evicted from my apartment. Why wouldn't I think you were monitoring me? Those things are in the past, Mom. We're trying to move forward. Moving forward doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen, David. It means acknowledging what happened and making changes so it doesn't happen again. Fine. What changes do you want me to make? The question was asked in the tone of someone humoring an unreasonable person, but I decided to take it seriously anyway. I want you to stop treating me like someone who needs to be managed instead of someone who deserves to be respected. I want you to stop making assumptions about my competence or my decision-making ability. I want you to ask for my permission before involving yourself in my medical or financial affairs. And I want you to understand that I have the right to say no to you. The right to say no to help. The right to say no to anything. Help that comes with conditions isn't help, David. It's control. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Mom, I don't know how to have a relationship with you where I'm not allowed to worry about you or try to help you. I'm not asking you not to worry about me. I'm asking you not to let your worry override my autonomy. What if you make decisions I think are dangerous? Then you tell me your concerns, and I take them into consideration, and I make my own decisions. And if I think you're not capable of making good decisions, then you respect my right to make bad decisions, as long as I'm competent to make them. And who decides whether you're competent? Medical professionals, legal professionals, people with training and expertise and no financial interest in the outcome. Not family? Not family. He looked genuinely confused by this concept, as if the idea of limits on family authority was foreign to him. Mom, I feel like you're asking me to just stand by and watch you make mistakes without trying to prevent them. I'm asking you to treat me like an adult. Even when you're old and sick, especially when I'm old and sick. That's when I'll need the most protection from people who think they know what's best for me. The 15 minutes I had allotted for our conversation were almost up. David hadn't demonstrated any fundamental shift in his understanding of our relationship, but he also hadn't tried to argue me out of my position or convince anyone that I was incompetent. Maybe that was progress. David, I want to have a relationship with you, but it has to be on terms that work for both of us. I can't go back to being the person who accepts any treatment in exchange for your attention. What if I can't accept you making decisions I disagree with? Then I guess we don't have a relationship. The words hung in the air between us, final and sad and somehow also liberating. I don't want that, Mom. Neither do I. But I won't sacrifice my dignity for it anymore. He left without saying goodbye, and I could hear him talking to Laura in the hallway. Their voices were too low for me to make out the words, but the tone was tense, frustrated, defeated. An hour later, I was discharged with instructions to follow up with my cardiologist and to take things easy for a few days. The cardiac stress had been caused by a combination of factors: medication, interactions, dehydration, and emotional strain, but nothing that required ongoing hospitalization. Jennifer walked me to the hospital entrance where Mrs. Hernandez was waiting with a taxi. "Mija, how are you feeling?" "I'm feeling like myself," I told her. Finally. The weeks that followed were the quietest I had experienced in years. David didn't call. Laura didn't send passive-aggressive text messages. No one showed up at my door unannounced or tried to involve themselves in my medical appointments. At first, I found myself waiting for the phone to ring, expecting the familiar patterns to reassert themselves. But as the days passed, I began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. I had drawn a line, and they had decided not to cross it. Whether that decision was motivated by respect for my autonomy or simple recognition that the cost of fighting me was higher than the cost of leaving me alone, I didn't know. But the result was the same. For the first time in years, I was free to live my life on my own terms. I started painting more seriously, taking advanced classes and experimenting with different techniques. My apartment filled with canvases covered in colors and shapes that pleased me for reasons I couldn't articulate to anyone else. I joined a book club at the library, where I discovered that I had opinions about literature that were interesting to other people. I signed up for walking tours of different Manhattan neighborhoods, learning about the history and architecture of the city I had lived in for decades without really seeing. I planned another trip, this time to Washington, D.C., to visit the Smithsonian museums. I bought plane tickets without consulting anyone, made hotel reservations in my own name, and spent a weekend wandering through galleries full of artifacts from American history. Standing in front of the original Star-Spangled Banner, I thought about the courage it had taken for the people of my country's past to fight for the right to determine their own destiny. My battle had been much smaller, much more personal, but it had required the same fundamental commitment: the willingness to risk everything I thought I had in order to claim something I had never fully possessed: my independence. On a warm day in June, 6 months after my hospitalization, I was sitting in Central Park reading when I saw David walking toward me across the grass. He was alone, which surprised me, and he looked hesitant in a way that was unlike him. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, David. Can I sit with you for a few minutes?" I gestured to the other end of the bench, and he sat down carefully, as if he were afraid of startling me. "I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital," he began, "about treating you like an adult and respecting your autonomy." I waited for him to continue. "I think I understand now why you felt like Laura and I were trying to control you. Looking back at some of the things we did, I can see how they must have felt invasive and disrespectful. An apology. Not a complete one. Not one that acknowledged the full scope of what they had done to me, but a beginning. I appreciate you saying that, David. I was wondering if we could try to have a different kind of relationship. One where I don't try to manage your decisions and you don't shut me out completely. What would that look like to you?" "I don't know. Maybe we could have lunch sometimes, or I could call you just to talk. And we could both agree not to try to fix each other's lives." Not to try to fix each other's lives. It was a surprisingly mature way to think about adult family relationships. "I'd be willing to try that," I said. "What would you need from me to make it work?" "I'd need you to accept that I'm competent to make my own decisions, even when you disagree with them. I'd need you to ask for permission before involving yourself in my medical or financial affairs. And I'd need you to understand that my choices about my own life don't require your approval." He nodded slowly. "That's hard for me, but I think I can learn to do it. And David, if you backslide into trying to control me, I'll end the relationship again. I won't keep having the same fight over and over." "I understand." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching people walk their dogs and children play on the playground equipment. The afternoon light was golden, filtering through the leaves of the trees that had turned full green with summer. "Mom, Can I ask you something? Are you happy? The question surprised me with its directness. Yes, I said, and realized that it was true. I'm happy. Even without the family relationships you used to have? David, I never had the family relationships I thought I had. I had the illusion of family relationships. What I have now is honest, and that makes me happier than any illusion could. What about Laura? What about her? Would you be willing to try to have a relationship with her too? I thought about this carefully. Laura had been the architect of much of the manipulation and control I had experienced. She had been the one pushing David to take action, framing me as a burden and a problem to be solved. Not right now, I said. Maybe eventually, if she demonstrates that she understands what went wrong and why, but for now, I'm only interested in rebuilding my relationship with you. That's fair. Another silence. This one slightly less comfortable. I could sense that David wanted to ask me other questions about my finances, my health, my plans for the future, but was restraining himself from crossing the boundaries I had established. The restraint itself was a gift, evidence that he was taking my requirements seriously. David, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were trying to take control of my medical care, did you really believe you were helping me? Or did you know you were prioritizing your own interests over mine? It was a hard question, but I needed to understand his motivations if we were going to move forward. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the ground. I think it was both, he said finally. I was scared about what would happen if you got sicker and couldn't take care of yourself, and I thought it would be easier for everyone if we planned for that ahead of time. But I was also scared about how your medical expenses might affect Laura and me financially, and I wanted to protect our assets. Our assets. Not his assets, not their family's assets. Our assets. As if Laura's interests were automatically aligned with his in a way that mine weren't. But he had been honest with me, which was more than I had expected. Thank you for telling me the truth. Does it change anything? Knowing that I wasn't acting purely out of concern for you? It changes everything, David. It means I can trust you to be honest with me about your motivations. That's the foundation of any real relationship. We made tentative plans to have lunch the following week, just the two of us, with no agenda other than enjoying each other's company. When he left, he kissed my forehead in a way that reminded me of the little boy he had been, and I felt something in my chest that I had almost forgotten. Maternal love uncomplicated by fear or resentment or the need to protect myself. It wasn't the same love I had felt when he was young, and I would have done anything to ensure his happiness. It was more careful, more conditional, more honest, but it was still love. That night, I called Mrs. Hernandez to tell her about my conversation with David. Mija, that's wonderful news. You must be so relieved. I am, but I'm also cautious. People don't change their fundamental patterns overnight. No, but they can change their behavior if the consequences of not changing become too expensive. The consequences of not changing become too expensive. That was exactly right. David hadn't experienced a spiritual awakening about respecting my autonomy. He had simply learned that the cost of trying to control me was higher than the cost of accepting my independence. But motivation mattered less than behavior. If he treated me with respect, the reasons behind that respect were less important than the respect itself. Over the following months, David and I slowly rebuilt our relationship on new terms. We had lunch once a month, always in public places, always with defined time limits. He asked me about my painting classes and my book club and my travel plans, but he didn't offer advice or express concerns about my choices. When I mentioned that I was considering moving to a smaller apartment to reduce my living expenses, he asked if I wanted help looking at properties, but he didn't try to steer me toward senior communities or assisted living facilities. When I told him I had updated my will and my advance directives, he thanked me for letting him know but didn't ask to see the documents or try to influence my decisions. It was a careful, limited relationship, but it was genuine in ways our previous relationship had never been. Laura remained absent from these interactions, and I didn't ask about her. David occasionally mentioned her in passing, their vacation plans, her work projects, but he never pressured me to include her or suggested that my relationship with him was incomplete without her participation. I assumed she was unhappy about this arrangement, but that was David's problem to manage, not mine. In October, almost a year after that Christmas night in the hospital, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a woman named Susan Chen, who introduced herself as a social worker with Elder Services. Mrs. Henderson, I'm calling because we've received some concerning reports about your living situation and your relationship with your family members. I was wondering if we could schedule a time to meet and discuss these reports. My heart sank. After months of peace, David and Laura were apparently trying again to have me declared incompetent. What kind of reports? I asked. Reports suggesting that you've become isolated from your family and may be making decisions that put your safety at risk. Isolated from family. Making decisions that put my safety at risk. The language was familiar, the same accusations wrapped in slightly different words. Ms. Chen, I had a comprehensive evaluation by Adult Protective Services earlier this year, and they found no evidence of any problems. I also have documentation from a geriatric psychiatrist confirming my competency. Have you reviewed those records? I don't have access to those records, Mrs. Henderson. These are new reports from different sources. What sources? I'm not able to discuss the specifics over the phone, but I'd very much like to meet with you to go over the concerns that have been raised. I made an appointment for the following week, then immediately called Sarah Rodriguez. Mrs. Henderson, I thought we'd resolve these issues. Do you have any idea who might have filed new reports? I assume it was Laura, maybe with support from other family members, but David and I have been rebuilding our relationship for months. I can't believe he would be part of this. Well, let's not jump to conclusions. Let me see what I can find out about these reports before your meeting with Ms. Chen. 2 days later, Sarah called me back with information that shattered the fragile trust I had been rebuilding with David. Mrs. Henderson, the reports came from your son and daughter-in-law. They were filed 3 weeks ago, and they allege that you've become paranoid and suspicious, that you've cut yourself off from family members who are trying to help you, and that you're making erratic financial decisions. David, the son who had been having lunch with me monthly, who had been asking about my painting classes and listening to my travel stories, who had promised to respect my autonomy and treat me like an adult. He had been playing a long game, rebuilding my trust so that his betrayal would be more devastating when it came. Sarah, what can we do? The same thing we did before. We fight. But Mrs. Henderson, this is going to be harder now because they can claim that your refusal to accept their help is evidence of your paranoia. They're going to use your independence against you. Use my independence against me. The very thing I had fought so hard to reclaim was now being twisted into evidence of my incompetence. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by my paintings and my books, and all the evidence of the life I had built for myself, and I wondered if I had the energy to fight this battle again. But then I thought about Mrs. Hernandez, who had fought for her sister's right to self-determination. I thought about all the women throughout history who had refused to be managed and controlled by people who claimed to love them. I thought about the person I had become over the past year, the person who painted what she saw rather than what others expected her to see. I wasn't going back. Whatever it cost me, whatever I had to sacrifice, I wasn't going back to being someone else's version of myself. The meeting with Susan Chen took place in her downtown office on a gray November morning that reminded me of the day I had first discovered David's deception. She was a professionally dressed woman in her 40s who spoke in the careful, neutral tones of someone trained not to reveal her own opinion. Mrs. Henderson, thank you for coming in. I want to assure you that my only concern is your well-being and safety. Your well-being and safety as defined by whom? I wondered, but I kept my thoughts to myself. I understand you've received some reports about my situation. Can you tell me what specific concerns have been raised? She opened a file on her desk and consulted her notes. The reports suggest that you've become suspicious of family members who are trying to help you, that you've isolated yourself from people who care about you, and that you've been making financial decisions that seem inconsistent with your previous patterns. Suspicious of family members who are trying to help me, isolated from people who care about me, financial decisions inconsistent with my previous patterns. Every positive change I had made in my life was being reframed as evidence of decline. Can you be more specific about these financial decisions? Well, for example, taking expensive trips when you're on a fixed income, spending money on art supplies and classes when you should be saving for future medical expenses, taking trips, buying art supplies, living my life according to my own priorities rather than David and Laura's assessment of what my priorities should be. Ms. Chen, I'm 73 years old. If I don't take trips and pursue interests that bring me joy now, when exactly am I supposed to do those things? Of course you have the right to enjoy yourself, Mrs. Henderson. The question is whether these decisions are being made with appropriate consideration of your long-term needs. Appropriate consideration. Who gets to determine what's appropriate? I handed her copies of all my documentation, the psychiatric evaluation, the financial assessment I'd had done showing that my spending was well within my means, the medical records proving my competency. She spent several minutes reviewing the papers, and I watched her expression shift as she read. Mrs. Henderson, these documents all seem to indicate that you're fully competent and managing your affairs appropriately. I'm not sure why concerns are being raised about your decision-making. Perhaps because the people raising the concerns benefit from having control over my decisions. What do you mean by that? I mean that my son and daughter-in-law have been trying for over a year to take control of my medical and financial affairs. When I refused to allow that and established boundaries in our relationship, they began characterizing my independence as mental illness. She made notes as I spoke, and I could see her beginning to understand the real dynamic at play. Mrs. Henderson, have you had any contact with your son recently? We've been having lunch monthly for the past 6 months. As far as I knew, we were rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. And he didn't mention any concerns about your well-being during these lunches? No, quite the opposite. He seemed to accept and support my independence. But 3 weeks ago, he filed a report claiming that you've become paranoid and are making poor decisions. The contradiction was obvious, even to someone who didn't know the full history of our relationship. Ms. Chen, I think my son has been using our monthly lunches to gather information he could use to support a claim of incompetence. I think he's been playing a long game, hoping to convince me that he had changed while actually planning his next attack on my autonomy. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Henderson, based on my conversation with you and the documentation you've provided, I see no evidence of any cognitive impairment or decision-making deficits. I'm going to recommend that this case be closed with no further action. Relief flooded through me, but it was tinged with sadness. David had betrayed me again, more cruelly this time because he had convinced me to hope that he had changed. Thank you, Ms. Chen. Mrs. Henderson, can I give you some advice? Please, document everything. Keep records of all your interactions with your family members, all your medical appointments, all your financial decisions. If they try this again, and they probably will, you'll need proof of your competency and evidence of their pattern of harassment. If they try this again, of course they would try again. This wasn't about genuine concern for my welfare. This was about control, and people who are determined to control you don't give up just because their first few attempts fail. That evening, I called David's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm and familiar. Hi, Mom. How are you? I'm disappointed in you, David. A pause. What do you mean? I mean, I know about the report you filed with Elder Services. I know about the claims that I'm paranoid and making poor decisions. I know that while you were pretending to rebuild our relationship, you were actually gathering ammunition to use against me. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, Laura, and I are genuinely concerned about some of the choices you've been making. Stop. The word came out harder than I intended. Just stop. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is about concern. This is about control, and we both know it. That's not true, Mom. We love you, and we want what's best for you. What you want is what's convenient for you, what's profitable for you, what eliminates me as a potential burden on your lifestyle. That's not fair. David, what would be fair is if you treated me like a competent adult with the right to make my own decisions. What would be fair is if you stopped trying to invalidate my independence every time I exercise it. Mom, can we please talk about this in person? I think there's been a misunderstanding. There's been no misunderstanding. You filed a false report claiming I'm incompetent because you don't like the way I'm living my life. You used our reconciliation as an opportunity to spy on me and gather information you could use against me. You betrayed my trust in the cruelest possible way. Mom, please don't do this. Don't throw away our relationship over a misunderstanding. I'm not throwing away our relationship, David. You already did that. I'm simply acknowledging what you did. What does this mean? It means I'm done. I'm done trying to maintain a relationship with someone who sees me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I'm done hoping you'll change. I'm done making excuses for your behavior. Mom, you're my only family. You can't just cut me out of your life. Watch me. I hung up the phone and turned off the ringer. Whatever David and Laura did next, I didn't want to hear about it until it had been filtered through my attorney, and I could respond to it strategically rather than emotionally. The next morning, I called Mrs. Hernandez and asked if she wanted to take a trip to Philadelphia with me. I had been wanting to see the Museum of Art there, and I thought it would be nice to have company. Mija, are you sure you're ready to travel? You seem upset about something. I told her about David's latest betrayal, about the false reports and the manipulation, and my decision to end our relationship permanently. I'm not upset, Mrs. Hernandez. I'm liberated. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to worry about managing anyone else's expectations or making excuses for anyone else's behavior. I don't have to hope that someone will change or wonder whether this time will be different. But Mija, he's your son. He's a person who happens to share some of my genetic material. That doesn't give him the right to control my life or diminish my dignity. What about Christmas? What about holidays? What about them? I'll spend them exactly how I want to spend them, with people who see me as I am rather than as they wish I were. She was quiet for a moment. You sound different, Margaret. Stronger. I feel different. I feel like myself. We booked our trip to Philadelphia for the following week. It was my third solo vacation, or rather, my third vacation taken without David's permission or input, and I was looking forward to it with uncomplicated pleasure. The night before we were scheduled to leave, my phone rang despite the fact that I had turned off the ringer. It was plugged into charge, and apparently emergency calls could still get through. The caller ID showed the name of the hospital where I had been treated almost a year earlier. Mrs. Henderson? This is Dr. Ike Martinez from the emergency department at Mount Sinai. You were brought in by ambulance about an hour ago and were trying to reach your emergency contact. I was brought in by ambulance, but I was standing in my apartment, fully conscious and perfectly healthy. I think there's been some mistake, Dr. Martinez. I'm at home and I haven't been to the hospital tonight. Are you sure this is Margaret Henderson? Address 1247 Amsterdam Avenue, apartment 4B? That was my address. Yes, that's me, but I'm telling you I'm at home. Ma'am, that's impossible. We have a Margaret Henderson here who was brought in unconscious about an hour ago. She's awake now, but she seems confused and disoriented. Someone was in the hospital using my name and my address, claiming to be me. Dr. Martinez, I think someone is impersonating me. Can you verify the identity of the person you're treating? What do you mean, impersonating you? I mean, someone is pretending to be me in order to… Actually, I'm not sure what they're trying to accomplish. Can you check the patient's ID? Hold on, let me go back and look at her identification. He was gone for several minutes, and when he came back, his voice was different. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you some questions. The person we're treating has your driver's license, your insurance cards, and she knows details about your medical history. Are you absolutely certain you're at home? I looked around my apartment, at the familiar furniture and the paintings on the walls, and Mrs. Hernandez sitting on my sofa looking concerned. I'm absolutely certain. Mrs. Hernandez, my neighbor, is sitting right here with me. We were planning to leave for Philadelphia tomorrow morning. This is very unusual. Can you come to the hospital so we can sort this out? Come to the hospital to prove that I was myself. The absurdity of the situation struck me even as I recognized its potential danger. Someone was impersonating me in a medical setting, which meant they could make medical decisions in my name, sign documents I had never seen, and create records that could be used against me later. Dr. Martinez, I'll be there as soon as possible. But I want you to know that this is almost certainly related to ongoing attempts by family members to have me declared incompetent. Someone is trying to create a medical emergency that doesn't exist. Ma'am, I have to tell you, that sounds a little paranoid. Paranoid. Even the emergency room doctor was using David and Laura's language. Dr. Martinez, I understand why it sounds paranoid, but I've been dealing with this situation for over a year, and I have legal documentation of multiple attempts to undermine my independence and autonomy. Someone impersonating me in a medical setting fits the pattern perfectly. Well, let's just get you down here and figure out what's happening. Mrs. Hernandez and I took a taxi to the hospital, and the ride gave me time to think through the possibilities. Someone who looked enough like me to pass casual inspection, who had access to my personal information, who knew enough about my medical history to answer basic questions. I could only think of one person who met those criteria: Laura. We were about the same height and general build. Her hair was blonde while mine was gray, but hair color was easy to change. She would have access to my personal information through David, and she certainly would know my medical history from all the records David had gathered during his previous attempts to take control of my health care. But what was the end game? Creating a fake medical emergency wouldn't automatically give them control over my affairs. Unless the goal was to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation, based on my insistence that I hadn't been to the hospital. Unless they were planning to claim that my denial of being treated was evidence of severe cognitive impairment. It was diabolical, but it was also exactly the kind of elaborate scheme that Laura would devise. At the hospital, Dr. Martinez met us in the lobby. He was a young man who looked tired and confused, clearly dealing with a situation that was outside his normal experience. Mrs. Henderson, I have to say, this is the strangest case I've encountered in 10 years of emergency medicine. What's the status of the person who's impersonating me? Well, that's what's so odd. When I went back to check her identification more carefully, she was gone. She had apparently signed herself out while I was on the phone with you. Gone. Of course she was gone. The moment Laura realized that I had been contacted and was coming to the hospital, she would have had to abandon the performance. Did she leave any paperwork, any medical records, or insurance claims? She did sign herself out, which means we have a signature, and we ran some basic tests before she became conscious, so there would be blood work and other records. Dr. Martinez, I need copies of all of that documentation. If someone is impersonating me for fraudulent purposes, I need evidence. Of course. But Mrs. Henderson, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you weren't here earlier tonight? Sometimes when people have medical emergencies, they don't remember them clearly. Dr. Martinez, I've been home all evening with a witness. We were packing for a trip to Philadelphia. I never lost consciousness. I never called an ambulance, and I never came to this hospital. He looked at Mrs. Hernandez. Ma'am, can you confirm that Mrs. Henderson was with you this evening? Yes, doctor. We were together from about 6 o'clock until you called. She never left her apartment. This is very unusual. He paused, thinking. Mrs. Henderson, you mentioned ongoing attempts by family members to have you declared incompetent. Do you think this incident could be related to that? I think it's almost certainly related to that. Someone wanted to create a medical record showing that I had been brought to the hospital unconscious and confused. If I had denied that this happened, it would have been evidence of cognitive impairment. But if you had confirmed that it happened, then there would be medical documentation of a serious health episode that could be used to support future claims about my diminishing capacity. So either way, this incident would have worked against your interests. Exactly. Dr. Martinez shook his head. Mrs. Henderson, if what you're saying is true, this represents a very sophisticated form of elder abuse. Elder abuse. Finally, someone was using the correct language for what David and Laura had been doing to me. Dr. Martinez, how often do you see cases like this? I don't see cases exactly like this. But I do see a lot of situations where adult children try to manipulate their parents' medical records to support guardianship petitions or insurance claims. What's unusual here is the level of planning and deception involved. I spent another hour at the hospital, reviewing the records from the impersonator's visit and making copies of everything for my attorney. The signature on the discharge papers was clearly not mine, though it was a reasonable approximation. The blood work showed normal results for a healthy woman in her 70s. Most tellingly, the impersonator had provided David's phone number as her emergency contact. On the taxi ride home, Mrs. Hernandez was uncharacteristically quiet. Mija, I'm scared for you. These people, they're not going to stop. No, they're not going to stop. But I'm not going to be intimidated by them either. What if they try something even more extreme next time? Then I'll deal with it. But Mrs. Hernandez, I can't live my life in fear of what David and Laura might do next. I can't let their manipulation control my choices or limit my freedom. But what if something happens to you? What if they find a way to have you committed or take away your apartment or your money? Then I'll fight them from whatever position I'm in. But I refuse to surrender my independence preemptively just because they might find a way to take it from me. She squeezed my hand. You're braver than I would be. I'm not brave, Mrs. Hernandez. I'm just tired of being afraid. The next morning, we left for Philadelphia as planned. I wasn't going to let David and Laura's latest attack disrupt my life or prevent me from doing things that brought me joy. The Philadelphia Museum of Art was everything I had hoped it would be. We spent hours wandering through galleries full of paintings and sculptures that reminded me why I had fallen in love with art in the first place. Standing in front of a Van Gogh painting of sunflowers, I thought about the courage it must have taken for him to paint his own vision, rather than what others expected to see. That evening, in our hotel room overlooking the city, I called Sarah Rodriguez to tell her about the impersonation incident. Mrs. Henderson, this is a serious escalation. We need to file a police report immediately. For what? Identity theft? Medical fraud? All of the above. Someone impersonated you in a medical setting, used your name and personal information, and created false medical records. Those are all crimes. But we don't have proof that it was Laura. We don't need proof to file a report. We just need evidence that the crime occurred, which we have. The investigation will determine who was responsible. Will filing a police report prevent them from trying something like this again? It might. And if they do try again, we'll have documentation of a pattern of harassment and fraud that will support our case. Our case. I like the sound of that. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. When I returned to New York, I filed a police report and provided all the documentation from the hospital. Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in elder abuse cases, took my statement and assured me that the investigation would be thorough. Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that what's happening to you is more common than most people realize. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets sometimes engage in very sophisticated forms of manipulation and fraud. What's the typical outcome in cases like this? It depends on how persistent the perpetrators are and how determined the victims are to fight back. In your case, you've been very proactive about documenting everything and establishing your competency. That puts you in a stronger position than many people in similar situations. What should I expect next? They'll probably try a different approach. If medical impersonation didn't work, they might try something financial, attempting to access your bank accounts or claiming you've given them power of attorney. Or they might go back to the social services route and try to have you investigated again. And if they do, then we'll have additional evidence of harassment and abuse. Mrs. Henderson, the key is to keep documenting everything and to keep living your life normally. Don't let their attempts to intimidate you change your behavior or limit your choices. Keep living your life normally. It was the same advice Mrs. Hernandez had given me, and it was becoming my mantra. Over the following weeks, I did exactly that. I continued with my painting classes, my book club meetings, my walks through Central Park. I planned another trip, to Boston again, because I had loved it so much the first time. I bought myself a new winter coat that was purely decorative rather than practical. I lived as if David and Laura's attempts to control me were irrelevant to my actual life, because they were. Their power over me had always been based on my fear of losing their approval, my assumption that I needed their presence in my life even if that presence came with conditions that diminished my dignity. But I had learned something important over the past year. I could choose who to love and how to love them. I could choose what relationships to maintain and on what terms. I could choose to prioritize my own well-being over other people's comfort with my choices. For the first time in my adult life, my love was unconditional. Not my love for others, but my love for myself. Christmas came again, nearly a year after that night in the hospital, when everything had started to change. I spent it with Mrs. Hernandez and her extended family, surrounded by warmth and laughter and the kind of affection that doesn't come with strings attached. As I watched Mrs. Hernandez's grandchildren open their presents, I thought about the Christmas mornings I had spent with David when he was young, the joy on his face when he saw the gifts I had saved for months to buy, the way he would throw his arms around me and tell me I was the best mother in the world. I felt sadness for the loss of that relationship, but I also felt something else. Gratitude. Gratitude for the person I had become in the absence of that relationship. Gratitude for the strength I had discovered when I was forced to defend myself. Gratitude for the friends who had supported me and the professionals who had believed me, and the life I had built on terms that honored who I actually was, rather than who someone else wanted me to be. That night, after Mrs. Hernandez's family had gone home, and we were sitting in my apartment drinking tea and looking at my latest paintings, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. Mija, do you ever regret fighting back? Do you ever wish you had just let them take control? I considered the question seriously. There had been moments of loneliness, moments when I wondered if submission might have been easier than the constant vigilance required to maintain my independence. No, I said finally, I don't regret it. Because even if fighting back had cost me everything, my relationship with David, my apartment, my financial security, it would have been worth it to know that I had tried to maintain my dignity. And what if they had succeeded? What if they had managed to have you declared incompetent? Then I would have fought them from whatever institution they put me in. I would have filed appeals, demanded evaluations, contacted advocacy organizations. I would never have stopped fighting. Why? What made you so determined? It was a good question. What had transformed me from someone who accepted any treatment in exchange for the illusion of family connection into someone willing to risk everything for the right to self-determination? Because I realized that the person David and Laura wanted me to be, compliant, dependent, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered, wasn't actually me. She was a performance I had been giving for so many years that I had almost forgotten it was a performance. And who is the real you? I looked around my apartment, at the paintings I had created, the books I had chosen, the furniture I had arranged according to my own sense of beauty and comfort. The real me is someone who paints what she sees rather than what others expect her to see. Someone who takes trips because she enjoys them, not because anyone else approves. Someone who chooses her relationships based on how those relationships make her feel about herself. Someone who fights back when people try to diminish her. Yes, someone who fights back. 6 months later, I received a letter from David. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter on personal stationery. Dear Mom, it began, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. Laura and I made serious mistakes in how we approached our concerns about your well-being, and I realize now that we caused you tremendous pain. I want you to know that we've stopped all attempts to interfere in your life. No more reports to social services, no more monitoring of your activities, no more efforts to influence your medical or financial decisions. You were right that those things were about control rather than care, and I'm ashamed that it took me so long to understand that. I don't expect you to forgive me or want a relationship with me. I just wanted you to know that I recognize what I did wrong and that I won't do it again. If you ever decide you want to talk, I'll be here. But I understand if you don't want that. Love, David. I read the letter several times, looking for the manipulation, the conditions, the subtle attempts to reestablish control. But it seemed genuinely straightforward. An apology without demands, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing without excuses. I showed it to Mrs. Hernandez. What do you think, Mija? Do you believe him? I think he's learned that trying to control me is more expensive than leaving me alone. Whether that translates into genuine respect for my autonomy, I don't know. Are you going to respond? Not right now. Maybe not ever. I don't owe him a response just because he apologized. But do you want a relationship with him? It was the hardest question she could have asked, despite everything David had done to me, despite the betrayals and the manipulation and the fundamental disrespect he had shown for my humanity. He was still my son. The love I felt for him was complicated by anger and disappointment and the need to protect myself, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I want a relationship with the person he might become if he actually changes. But I don't want a relationship with the person he's been for most of my adult life. How will you know if he's changed? Time, consistency, behavior that demonstrates respect for my choices even when he disagrees with them. And if he never changes, then I'll continue to live the life I've built without him. It's a good life, Mrs. Hernandez. I'm happy. And I was happy. Not the desperate, dependent happiness of someone grateful for whatever scraps of affection were thrown her way, but the deep, sustainable happiness of someone living according to her own values and priorities. I had learned to paint. I had traveled to cities I'd always wanted to see. I had made friends who valued my opinions and enjoyed my company. I had created a home that reflected my tastes rather than someone else's expectations. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment, to defend my own interests, to prioritize my own well-being. I had become myself. Today, as I sit in my apartment surrounded by evidence of the life I've chosen to live, I think about the woman I was before that Christmas night in the hospital. She was kind, generous, loving, but she had forgotten that those qualities should extend to herself as well as to others. She had spent so many years caring for everyone else that she had stopped caring for herself. She had been so afraid of being alone that she had accepted relationships that left her feeling lonely. She had been so desperate to be needed that she had allowed herself to be used. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took months of fighting, months of learning to set boundaries, months of discovering who I was when I wasn't performing the role of the grateful, undemanding mother. But it happened, and it was worth every moment of struggle, every relationship I had to sacrifice, every comfortable illusion I had to abandon, because now I know something I didn't know before. Being alone with yourself is only lonely if you don't like the person you're alone with, and I like the person I've become very much. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where love felt like a transaction, where affection came with conditions and approval had to be constantly earned? Have you ever wondered whether the people who claim to care about you actually see you as a person or just as a role to be managed? If any of this story resonates with you, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to draw boundaries, to demand respect, to insist that your dignity matters as much as anyone else's comfort. The people who truly love you will adjust to your boundaries. The people who don't adjust were never really loving you. They were loving their version of you, the version that served their purposes. You deserve better than that. You deserve to be seen, respected, and valued for who you actually are. Have you lived through something like this? Or do you know someone who has? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this video helped you in any way, please like it and subscribe. Your support helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these difficult but important truths. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to refuse to participate in relationships that diminish your humanity. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who only want you if you agree to be smaller than you actually are. I learned that lesson late in life, but I learned it well. And now I share it with you, hoping that you won't have to wait as long as I did to discover the freedom that comes from being unapologetically yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, you are never too old, never too dependent, never too afraid to choose dignity over convenience, respect over familiarity, authentic love over the performance of love. Your life belongs to you. Live it accordingly.